Jack Smith is a prosecutor who was put there in order to screw up the election for the Republican Party. The people know it. I know it. Everybody knows it. And it's not going to happen. He is a person who is trying, and he works for Kamala and he works for Joe. This was a weaponization of government, and that's why it was released 30 days before the election. And it's nothing new in there, by the way, nothing new. They rigged the election. I didn't rig the election. They rigged the election.
That was former President Donald Trump speaking Wednesday in an exclusive interview with News Nation correspondent Ali Bradley. He made those comments just hours after the revised indictment brought by Special Prosecutor Jack Smith was unsealed. That revised indictment argues Trump should not receive presidential immunity for election interference charges related to the January 6th insurrection. This all comes after that controversial Supreme Court decision that ruled presidents were immune from prosecution for official acts. In the indictment, Smith argues Trump wasn't acting in an official capacity, saying, quote, "The defendant's scheme was a private one. He extensively used private actors and his campaign infrastructure to attempt to overturn the election results and operate in a private capacity as a candidate for office." Smith added, quote, "Because the executive branch has no role in the certification proceeding, and indeed the president was purposely excluded from it by design, prosecuting the defendant for his corrupt efforts regarding Pence poses no danger to the executive branch's authority or functioning." Joining us now to break down what it means for the former president is constitutional expert and criminal defense attorney Robert McWhirter. Robert, thanks for joining us. Jack Smith used some pretty strong language here, so just how damning is this indictment?
Well, it's very damning. The language is one thing, but the specificity is worse. He's pretty much laid out exactly what's going on here in a way and a detail that we haven't seen before. He's also basically foreshadowed who his witnesses are and how he's pieced together this case. And these witnesses are important because they go directly to the mental state of one Donald J. Trump and what his intent was during this entire period of time. These witnesses show that he knew that he lost that election, and yet he was still continuing to try to overturn it. And that's what this indictment provides, or this motion provides, that really hadn't been in detail before.
Yeah, that's true. We definitely did learn a lot more details here. So what comes next for Trump and his legal team?
Well, the judge is going to have to make a ruling. His legal team are going to challenge it. Look, this all happened in a kind of an interesting situation. Usually a case starts and the defense files motions. What happened here is the prosecution filed a motion because the U.S. Supreme Court, of course, last year created this immunity doctrine out of whole air. It's not really in the Constitution, but they didn't define what is and is not an official act. The president has immunity for official acts, but what is an official act? So what Jack Smith has done here is said, look, we've retailored this indictment, and all of these things are not official acts. And the defense will challenge that, and there will be a ruling, and presumably that ruling may be appealed again back up to the U.S. Supreme Court.
So do you anticipate that this indictment could impact Trump's campaign or just the election in general? At this point, it feels like there's already been a million October surprises, but do you think this could be like that for Trump? Are you expecting any significant impact?
No, I really don't think so. I think positions are pretty hardened on Donald Trump. I do not think that the specificity of this indictment changed what is generally already known about his participation leading up to January 6th and that insurrection and his role in it. Again, this provides specificity, but the general outline has already been established, if nothing else, by the bipartisan commission in Congress. And how much that affects the election, we're going to know in about 31 days.
Yeah, that's true. Time is certainly ticking. Robert McWhirter, as always, thanks so much for your insight.
My pleasure.
Former President Trump also spoke with News Nation about immigration and his proposed deportation policy that's drawn some criticism. Ali Bradley has the details from her exclusive interview.
Yeah, Bianca, and it's one of his biggest campaign promises here, telling America that he is going to carry out the biggest mass deportation that this country has seen. But there are some questions attached to that, right? How do you go find the individuals who don't want to be found? And then how do you remove people who legally have a right to due process with these notices to appear? Now, he said something that I hadn't heard the president say before. He said, in order to carry out this mass deportation, we need to lean heavily on local law enforcement.
We're going to be working with the local police and local law enforcement. They know everything. They know things that nobody would even think about knowing, but we're going to let them do their job because, they have not been allowed to do their job.
Now, Bianca, this all comes as DHS just released a new report on the kind of terror threat looking ahead in 2025. The report's showing that the terror threat remains heightened, especially as we enter into the 2024 election. Now, we have seen a record number of people cross the southern border over the last few years that have flagged on the terrorist watch list. So I asked the former president, how do you prevent these individuals from ever reaching U.S. soil in the first place? Take a listen.
And we're letting people in without any vetting. They're not even vetting. They're not even asking who these people are, where they're from, what country. They're just letting them walk through open borders.
Now, the controversy surrounding Springfield, Ohio, and the migrants from Haiti who are living there, that was brought up several times over the last few weeks and has made national headlines. It was a topic of contention in the vice presidential debate, a time where vice presidential candidate J.D. Vance said that he believes those individuals living there are there illegally, that they used a CBP One app that the Biden administration made a legal pathway. Now, the former president, we asked him about this, and he seemed to echo the sentiment coming from his vice presidential pick. Take a listen.
It was like a picture community. And all of a sudden, in a short period of time, they have 32,000 more people in there. It doesn't work.
Now, I pressed the former president on those deportation flights because here's the reality. They have not taken back deportation flights in Haiti or Venezuela for months. Venezuela has not received a deportation flight from the United States since February. Now, when it comes to what's happening at the southern border for our law enforcement, we've been reporting that they have seen IEDs, they've seen RPGs, literally right on the other side of the U.S.-Mexico border in Mexico. Now, the cartel are using these drones to intercept and scramble our drone technology. So I asked the former president, what do you do? How do you handle this situation? And how do you make sure that law enforcement at the southern border are safe and able to do their jobs? And he said, in order to combat the cartels, we need a military operation at this point.
These people have become military. They're very rich. They have a lot of money. They're among the richest people probably in the world. They're very rich and they're very evil.
Now, Bianca, the former president is actually returning to Butler, Pennsylvania this weekend. It will be his first trip back to that area where, of course, nearly 3 months ago, a gunman tried to assassinate the former president. I asked him about his security and safety concerns. He says that, of course, there is some concern, but he said he has unfinished business. He promised the people of Butler that he would be back, so he is going back. Bianca?
Thank you, Ali. You can catch her full interview with former President Trump right now on newsnationnow.com. President Biden will travel to Florida and Georgia today to assess damage from Hurricane Helene. This comes a day after the president spent some time in North and South Carolina, too. As of now, at least 166 people have been killed in the storm, and hundreds are still missing. To talk more about Biden's trip, we're joined now by The Hill's White House reporter, Alex Gangitano. Alex, thanks for joining us. Let's talk about Biden's trip. What is his plan, and what do you think we can expect out of his visit?
Yeah, so when he heads to Florida and Georgia, we know he's going to be surveying the area. He usually takes a helicopter ride around to look at the damage, look at what the water looks like, anything that first responders think is the necessary things for him to take a peek at, and then he'll be briefed by the officials on the ground. And then I'm sure we're going to hear from him the same message that he's been putting out over the last week in the wake of the hurricane, which is basically that this isn't a time for partisanship. Whether you're a red state or a blue state, you deserve the federal funding support. He also already has made that 100% of what these local governments spend will be reimbursed by the federal government for up to about 6 months or so. So these are all announcements that basically it's his time to, come across as somebody who doesn't want to play politics in this, but make sure that he shows up for every state, regardless of who the leadership is there.
Yeah, and this trip feels significant because it comes shortly after Vice President Kamala Harris's trip to Georgia. So walk us through that visit. Anything significant or of note that she said or did when she was there?
Yeah, so she also surveyed the area in Augusta, Georgia, basically did a briefing after and was just talking about how the devastation really affected her, looking at these homes, businesses, that have been taken out, the trees that have fallen, what the roadways look like. She really described the scene. And she also delivered this message of unity of she talked a lot about how neighbors come out in moments like this. It doesn't matter who you're voting for in November, you show up for the people in your community. Of course, she thanked the first responders. We saw her handing out meals in Georgia. So she definitely made an effort to be on the ground and see how the first responders are handling this, see how the community is responding. And I think when she's expected to go to more impacted areas days from now, we're going to see similar remarks from her as well.
Well, as you were sort of alluding to, this has become somewhat of a political issue, right? And Hurricane Helene has put the Trump-Vance climate change hoax theory under the spotlight. So I'm wondering if you think the Trump-Vance campaign might change their message a little bit, even if just during the campaign. What do you think?
Yeah, they could soften a little bit. I think it's the best way to think about it, because this is something that, Floridians, Georgians, are seeing the direct impacts of climate change, that talking about how this is a hoax isn't really the appropriate time. And we're only, a month out from Election Day. We know, though, that Senator Vance on the campaign stage, or on the debate stage this week, expressed some skepticism about climate change. Meanwhile, President Biden yesterday, while on the ground, said that if you are a climate change denier, you are, quote, brain dead. So I don't know if that was a stab at anybody directly, but the president is definitely trying to warn about these storms are going to get worse over time with more, rising sea levels, more impacts of climate change, that, we can align these two phenomenons right now and not to, be a denier about the case. So I'm curious if we see Vance change his tune a little bit, or the way that he talked on the debate stage, if that's what we'll see from him for the next month.
Yeah, it feels like even just that moment is a pretty stark change. But I do want to switch gears here to the campaign trail. Former Congresswoman Liz Cheney is going to be campaigning with Harris today in Wisconsin. Can you explain this move? Do you think the Harris campaign thinks that Cheney is going to help bring in some of those very few undecided voters? And also, I wonder, do you think that they're worried about potential blowback, either with undecided voters or Democratic voters?
Yeah, well, one thing is Liz Cheney is no stranger to blowback. She has been a staunch anti-Trump critic, and she's tough and knows how to handle that. I think in terms of the Biden campaign, I think Democrats who are very supportive of Vice President Biden are happy to see the tent expand so that they can win in November. I mean, she needs to recreate the map that President Biden was able to get in 2020, which included these critical swing states, which include independents or moderate Republicans. This move also is notable because they're speaking in Wisconsin at the site of the founding of the Republican Party. So it is kind of a very obvious attempt from Vice President Harris to say, if you're a Republican and you're sick of Trump, maybe you voted for him in 2016 and 2020, I have a campaign that can bring everybody together. Of course, it comes down to her, if they resonate with her policies or they think she's too far left, if Republicans actually do. But I think that when the Cheneys came out and endorsed Harris, it was such a big moment in this election. Former Vice President Dick Cheney is, of course, a very influential Republican, or he was for many years. And then Liz Cheney has become a household name. So I think the Harris campaign is hoping to monopolize on that and see maybe there'll be a Republican who feels more comfortable this election changing sides and voting for her.
Yeah, I'm interested to see if there will be any way to measure that, because I think that is such an interesting move. Now, one other big issue the Biden campaign and now the Harris campaign has had to deal with is Israel. They were they're faced with intense criticism for their support of Israel in the war against Hamas. We saw that a lot of Arab Americans were very upset. We saw what happened in Michigan during the primaries. But now some Arab Americans are rallying behind Harris and Walz. So can you explain what led to that shift? Like, what's going on now?
Yeah, it's really interesting. This group just launched that it's Arab Americans for Harris Walz, and it's a coalition that has come out and said, basically, yes, we're not thrilled with the way the Biden administration, that Vice President Harris is very much a part of, is handling the war in the Middle East. But at the same time, their argument is, but Trump would be worse, basically. They want to try to appeal to Arab Americans by saying he's actually going to make the violence, he's going to instigate violence even more so. He's not our ally, because there is a level of an incumbent disadvantage here that because he's not president, there's definitely voters who could say, well, things would be different under him, so I'll go with that. And I think basically they're trying to argue, but if he was president, things would actually be worse. Of course, we don't know that hypothetical, but they're coming out, interestingly, during this week that we've also seen polling from the Arab American Institute that more Arab Americans who were polled actually are supporting Trump than Harris, which is a huge blow to Democrats because usually that demographic tends to align more with Democrats. So I think this is all an effort for the Harris campaign and some supportive Arab Americans or pro-Palestinian Americans to try to reach out to those voters, because with only a month left, that's a pretty hard pill for them to swallow, that they're losing this really essential demographic, even without President Biden on the ticket. They were very angry with President Biden during the Democratic primary. Maybe the Harris campaign thought that they'd be less angry with her, but she's largely aligned with him on her pro-Israel stance as well.
Yeah, time is really of the essence, it seems. Alex Gangitano, thank you so much.
Thank you.
At least 9 people have been killed and 14 injured by an Israeli airstrike that hit a building in central Beirut, according to Lebanese officials. A grim scene in Lebanon right now as black smoke plumes from Beirut's skyline, the airstrike hitting just meters away from Lebanon's parliament. 5 other airstrikes hit targets overnight in a southern suburb. The IDF has announced more infantry and armored troops have joined ground raids in Lebanese border villages. Prior to the airstrikes, 46 people had been killed and 85 wounded in Israeli bombings in the last 24 hours, according to Lebanon's health ministry. Among those killed were civilians, rescue officers, and paramedics. One American was also killed who was in the country to take care of his elderly mother. President Biden warned Israel yesterday to exercise caution in their response.
We'll be discussing with the Israelis what they're going to do, but all 7 of us agree that they have a right to respond, but they should respond in proportion.
The latest strikes adds to fears that Israel's invasion into Lebanon could spark a regional war. A Democratic senator from Connecticut says he's worried Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu may be trying to influence the U.S. presidential election. Senator Chris Murphy said he's concerned because of Netanyahu's lack of interest in striking a peace deal in Gaza and threatening a broader war in the Middle East. Murphy made the remarks during an interview with CNN, acknowledging the possibility of a ceasefire before Election Day does not seem likely. The lack of a peace deal in Gaza is a political lightning rod for Vice President Harris as she seeks to be elected in November. More than 100,000 Michigan Democratic primary voters cast ballots for uncommitted to express their concerns over the White House's handling of Israel's war on Gaza. In the meantime, 13% of voters say they don't trust Vice President Harris or former President Trump when it comes to foreign policy. News Nation's Blake Berman has a look at the numbers in today's Political Minute.
Escalation in the Middle East, putting foreign policy front and center. I'm Blake Berman with News Nation. Iranian missiles aimed at Israel, our strongest ally in the Middle East. Vice President Kamala Harris and former President Donald Trump both responding. A reminder that November's winner will become the commander-in-chief.
They are very close to global catastrophe. We have a non-existent president and a non-existent vice president.
We will never hesitate to take whatever action is necessary to defend U.S. forces and interests against Iran and Iran-backed terrorists.
Now, a recent poll shows likely voters are divided on which candidate they prefer when it comes to overseeing foreign policy. 47% trust Trump more on the issue. 40% trust Harris. 13% say they'd prefer someone else. I'm Blake Berman, and this is the News Nation Political Minute.
Thank you, Blake. A judge has blocked a California bill cracking down on election deepfakes. The new law would allow any person to sue for damages over election deepfakes. U.S. District Judge John Mendez halted the bill, granting a preliminary injunction Wednesday, blocking it. Mendez acknowledged that artificial intelligence and deepfakes pose significant threats, but says the law likely violates the First Amendment. The deepfakes bill took effect last month after Governor Gavin Newsom signed it into law. Newsom also signed 2 other bills on AI, cracking down on the use of false images or videos in political ads. Both bills are among the toughest laws in the nation on the issue. And a Florida law banning people from experiencing homelessness from sleeping in public places has taken effect. The law is one of the most strict anti-homeless statutes in the country, with the state estimating that about 31,000 or more people experience homelessness in Florida. Municipalities are required to create assigned camping and sleeping spaces if shelters are full, with access to clean and operable restrooms and running water. Under the new law, residents, business owners, and the state can sue municipalities if they believe they aren't doing enough to deter homeless people from sleeping in public places. Republican Florida Governor Ron DeSantis said the state will not allow encampments to, quote, intrude on its citizens or undermine their quality of life. It is reported the state budgeted $30 million to help municipalities enact the law. Dock workers up and down the East Coast are on strike over disagreements on wages and automation, and the potential impact on the global economy, especially so close to a major U.S. election, is raising alarm bells. Now Florida Governor Ron DeSantis is mobilizing the Florida National Guard in response to the strikes. To break it all down for us, we're joined now by Taylor Giorno, a staff writer at The Hill who's been covering all of the developments for us. Taylor, thanks for joining us. Can you walk us through what's happening in Florida right now?
Yeah, so in Florida is unique in this larger port strike context. There's about 14 major ports on strike, and 3 of them are in Florida. That's way more than in any of the other states that are also experiencing similar port strikes. Now, you mentioned that Ron DeSantis is mobilizing the National Guard as part of an executive order. I'm trying to get more details from Ron DeSantis's office in terms of when these members of the National Guard might be at the ports, and also at what capacity they could bring these ports back up to speed on when they are mobilized. So when we have more details, we'll be reporting that in The Hill.
Okay, thank you for keeping us updated on that. But let's talk about the strike in general. What are some of the potential economic impacts here, and what industries are most at risk?
So the economic estimates vary on how big of a hit the U.S. economy is going to be taking day by day as this strike goes on. So it's anywhere from a few $100 million to as much as $5 billion per day. And that's going to be mostly felt on the economic side of things, but not necessarily in consumers' worlds, at least in the near term. So in the first week or so, consumers really aren't going to be seeing things on shelves, or aren't going to be seeing things disappearing from shelves. However, as the strike drags on, maybe a week or two, once that natural backlog that's in these ports starts getting worked through, once stores start running through their 3 to 4 week inventories that they've already set up, then you might see things particularly like perishable goods start to dwindle on the shelves. Also, auto parts are expected to be backed up because they sort of run on a just-in-time delivery schedule, as experts have described it to me. Pharmaceuticals may also experience a bit of a disruption, but some experts that I have spoken to say that pharmaceuticals might be flown in on more expensive air travel, because these are kind of things that need to be moved in and out.
So I think, first of all, it's interesting to see that there's such a disparity in some of those estimates that you gave, but companies are still pushing for Biden to end this strike, right? And there's talk about the Taft-Hartley option, though Biden has said he won't be pursuing that. So first, can you just explain how that would work? What is that option? And second, do you think there's any chance that he changes his mind, considering some of the risks that you just mentioned?
For sure. Well, first of all, I just want to say one thing about that economic disparity you mentioned. This is the first time the ILA has gone on strike in 50 years, and our volume of trade that we take in has changed significantly in that time. You know, back in 1977, when the dock workers went on strike, we were importing around 16% of our GDP. Now it's more than 28%. So experts that I've talked to say that what happens next, you know, we have estimates, but we are kind of in a different ballgame than we were 50 years ago. Now, you mentioned the Taft-Hartley Act. So this is a law that dates back to 1947. And basically, if President Biden were to invoke the Taft-Hartley Act, which he has said expressly he is not going to do, it basically would allow him as the president to ask a court to issue a 80-day cooling off period. Basically, get workers back to work, get the economy moving, and buy the parties more time to come to the bargaining table and come to an agreement. Now, again, he said that he's not going to do that. The last time this was used was in 2002 by President George W. Bush, and Biden really has cast himself and really wants his legacy to be as the most pro-union president in history. So he has doubled down, tripled down on saying, I'm not going to be doing that. Some experts that I've talked to said maybe he'll be singing a different song if this thing stretches on towards the end of next week, because we are at a pretty pivotal time in the election cycle. You know, we're less than 5 weeks out from an election, and the economy is the #1 issue among voters. And as I mentioned to you, this is poised to take a pretty big economic hit. And about that time, consumers might be seeing shortages on their shelves. They may be experiencing more hardship. So that may be putting more pressure on Biden and the administration to act in a way that is going to give some economic breathing room, because this is an issue where voters have said that they trust former President Trump more than they trust Biden or Harris. And they really want to make sure that the economy is strong going into such a pivotal time in the election cycle.
Yeah, definitely specific with that timing here. That is a huge concern, specifically for both candidates that you mentioned. So as far as we know, is Vice President Kamala Harris responding exactly in line with what Biden is saying? And also, how is former President Trump approaching this? Are there key differences, or are they all on the same page?
There's pretty consistent messaging from all of those three politicians that you've mentioned. So Biden came out with a statement right after saying, I stand with them. I want to see them have meaningful increases in their wages. Vice President Harris came out with a statement as well, saying that she wants to see a fair agreement for workers. And then former President Trump, who has, sparked some controversy in August, suggesting firing striking workers, came out and he said that he also supports the striking workers in this instance, and that he blamed, however, the strike on Biden and Harris, and said that this never would have gotten done under his watch. Whether that's true or not, we can speculate, but he's really using this as an opportunity to basically say, hey, this wouldn't have happened under my watch, and yeah.
All right, The Hill's Taylor Giorno, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
The economy is consistently listed as the #1 issue for voters, especially in the swing states. In the key swing state of Nevada, there's one economic campaign proposal that is gaining popularity there: no taxes on tips. It was an idea first floated by former President Trump. News Nation's Blake Berman takes an in-depth look at the issue as part of our continuing Swing State Spotlight series.
Joining us live from Las Vegas is our next star colleague, KLAS reporter John Langler, host of the Politics Now show, rather. John, thanks for being with us here on the Hill. Appreciate it. So no taxes on tips. Donald Trump's talking about it. Kamala Harris said, you know what, that's a good idea. How's this viewed out there in Nevada? Is this pocket aces running an inside straight? What is it out there?
You know, Blake, you can use any sort of casino metaphor you like. I'm sure all will apply. Certainly, people will be supportive of the idea of making money and not having it taxed. And because so many of the workers here in Las Vegas and in Southern Nevada work in the resorts, work in the casinos, tips are a big portion of their take-home pay. So the idea of it not being taxed got pretty much across the board pretty rave reviews from people that we spoke with. What is interesting, though, is that, you mentioned that former President Trump brought this up in June. The Culinary Union, one of the biggest power brokers in Southern Nevada, in Las Vegas, 60,000 members strong, they dismissed it initially. they've kind of changed their tune, but initially they thought it was kind of a stunt. We actually went to a roundtable and heard some of their thoughts.
That means nothing. And the people who are espousing that right now, to me, mean nothing unless they put a plan and say, okay, this is how it's going to work. And what about the other states and all that? You need to have something more than just say, okay, we're going to have no tax on tip. That means it is a slogan.
So that was right after former President Trump's speech here back in earlier in the summer. The skepticism didn't last long. Democrats soon jumped on board. Both Democratic senators of Nevada, the congressional delegation. We've heard from Vice President Kamala Harris, who said she supports it as well. And then earlier this month, Nevada Congressman Stephen Horsford proposed his own proposal, the TIPS Act, which is a different version of it. Let's see, we can hear him talk about. We've heard him talk about this. It's his method of no taxes on tips. We'll have to see if it really goes anywhere, though.
Hey, John, real quick. Obviously, economy issue number one. Within the economy, no taxes on tips. Where does that fall?
Well, it falls pretty high in Southern Nevada. I think we've done some polling through the Hill, of course, 8 News Now. We've looked at what people think about the biggest issue in Southern Nevada, in all of Nevada, and it's the economy. And the economy isn't just taxes on tips. It's housing prices, cost of groceries. Those are nationwide issues, of course. Taxes on tips is up there. It's not the main issue, though.
Interesting. John Langler, KLAS TV out there in Nevada. Thank you, sir. Appreciate it. Great reporting.
That's today's Daily Debrief. I'm Bianca Facchinei. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe to The Hill's YouTube channel. And come back here soon for the intersection between politics and policy.